Brace yourself.
There's something almost entrancing about Hotline Miami, even this long after its original release. It lavishly reveled in its own sense of ultraviolence. It's a glamorous game, one where maddening, murderous acts are treated with flashy artistic focus, never in competition with each other, but coming together in surreal, twisted harmony. And while many games have followed in the original Hotline Miami's footsteps over time, there's a reason that it's often considered one of the greatest indie games of all time. Skimping on either style or substance was never an option, not in the slightest. The series has become something of a cult hit, even with its controversially received sequel Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number. But even when isolated down to that heavy hitter of a debut, the original Hotline Miami had something to prove. Indie games had hit their stride by 2012. Digital download services had turned underground titles into widespread crowd pleasers, and Hotline Miami's stylish art was fueled by its complete indulgence of pulp ultraviolence, a vision of searing neon light drenched in shining plasma. It wasn't the first game to pull off this aesthetic, but it definitely was one of the more popular examples, one that transformed developers Dennaton Games into a force to be reckoned with in the indie sphere. And yeah, while I believe the game is full of thoughtful design, intense action, and excellent graphic direction, I think it's time we give the sounds of its insanity their just dues. Let's talk about the soundtrack of Hotline Miami. The soundtrack of the original Hotline Miami was composed by multiple musicians, many of which have grown into prolific artists in the indie electronica genre. From Perturbator to El Huervo to Scattle, the tracklist is packed with artists who specialize in electronics that perfectly encapsulate the pulp fiction that is Hotline Miami. It's not hard to be mesmerized by the dark aesthetic of the soundtrack, but what's especially shocking is just how each track fits into the larger puzzle of Hotline Miami's campaign. Each bit, whether it's in a mission or not, is placed just right, drawing out the best elements of the game's nasty, unchained essence. It jumps between tempos, moods, and styles like nobody's business, but makes it all fit into one brilliant, unified package. Harrowing and abrasive, Hotline Miami's soundtrack burns itself into your psyche. It's caustic in the best ways. And while Hotline Miami's gameplay might be drenched in lavish ultraviolence, it's easy to forget that it's a surprisingly contemplative game. It demands learning the layout, calculating where each enemy patrols, and using your skills and reflexes to navigate each stage with the utmost care. The corridors are narrow, the enemies armed to the teeth with weaponry, and even the slightest lapse in judgment can lead to a swift death. Every move matters in Hotline Miami, so you need to stay focused at every opportunity. So with that in mind, for a game that requires so much meaning and commitment behind every tactic, what does the music of Hotline Miami do? Well, throughout the game, more and more tracks use these thick, energetic beats to propel the player into a sense of blissful, violent euphoria. The beats, in wrapping themselves in such lavishly violent scenes, feel more like pulses, the heartbeat of the action. It makes perfect sense for the music to push itself back and forth, activating the metronome of the mind and putting the player into a zen-like sense of focus. When every move can be a matter of life and death, it's totally natural to feel a little breathless with a shotgun-armed enemy on the other side of the door, just steps away from you. When the player enters that state of flow, Hotline Miami's soundtrack complements that feeling, giving them a meditative collection of tunes that meld into the game's world, eliminating distractions and keeping the player in the headspace necessary to always be on guard. However, the musicians didn't use focus as a crutch, because Hotline Miami's soundtrack still manages to give its aesthetic razor-sharp teeth. You have something like Moon's Hydrogen, which begins with the propulsive heartbeat of a tempo before sounding off with these shrill electronic beeps. The beat is still danceable for sure, but those beeps are maddening in their melody. It actually makes the track a bit difficult to listen to, but much like the protagonist's strained psyche, it introduces a sense of panic and anxiety among the zen-like focus. Similarly, Turf is a full-on roar of a track, rising from an early boil into something explosive, perfect for the climactic confrontation of Jacket's final chapter, Showdown. Hotline Miami's soundtrack goes for these off-kilter aesthetics, it results in some incredibly arresting themes that are far too unsettling to overlook. Hotline Miami's soundtrack does so much to frame each moment with a feeling of nervousness, like you're just a step away from bursting at the seams. It's a monster of a track list, rich with gritty, nerve-wracking sounds that paint each stage with the same grim, caustic palette that the visuals and gameplay draw from. But even then, these beats are still so infectious. They repeat over and over again through each death, propelling things forward after the player continuously fails and reboots the stage. The player is thrown back into the madness, and the groovy tracks just keep coming. For example, the fantastic Miami Disco from Perturbator is drenched with synth-driven goodness, a flashy track that fits ingeniously with Jacket's murderous rampage throughout a club in town in the 8th chapter Push It. So much of the soundtrack carefully balances aesthetic palatability with repetitive meditation. The player can enjoy the groove while still staying honed in on the task at hand. Soon enough, you'll be instinctively bobbing your head to the song without missing a beat. It's such a careful methodology, keeping the player hypnotized and entranced, but never to the point of fully tuning out the music. It hits the golden mean. But as the stages are cleared and the tunes begin to defuse, Hotline Miami takes a new route. There are so many tracks in the song list that go in an entirely different direction, sacrificing energy for something that feels out of place in the most unsettling way possible. Crush remains one of the most chilling tracks, when the protagonist must walk past the remains of their dirty work. The hushed, droning noise emits a disturbing sense of solitude, which is absolutely distressing when you're forced to return to the car outside, walking across the bodies of all of the people you just killed, as if they're nothing. There's barely any stimulation in these scenes. Crush is just steps away from full-on silence, but it's not. Instead, feeling like a very low voice in the back of your head reminding you that this entire scene was your own doing. With Crush, the player's actions seem peaceful, but in a filthy, demented sense. Once the player wraps up the chapter and gets to the car, the glistening, shimmering Miami plays, acting as a cooldown from the frenetic, adrenaline-pumping action of the main stages. As your score compiles and you're given a ranking, layers of drums pile on and even more clean notes play. Miami feels liberating and relaxing, a chance for the player to catch their breath after the bloodbath is over, a return to peace and normalcy. It's totally ironic considering Hotline Miami's subject matter, and when you think about it, it's actually incredibly grim. Miami pulls the player out of the haze, bringing them back down to earth, and giving off a vibe like what just happened didn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. It's all par for the course. It's nothing to worry about. In fact, many of the tracks that play between each stage don't follow the same vibes as the pulsing synthwave of most of the mission themes. The track Daisuke plays when Jacket visits the various shops, the closest the game gets to a sense of normalcy. It's a low-key jam that feels almost relaxing, which is wild considering that so much of the game is anything but peaceful. It's unnerving that these scenes sporadically pepper a story that's so disturbing in its subject matter, but the soundtrack does an incredible job in making these relaxing moments sound out of place. For a murderous lunatic, why should events this mundane even be occurring? That's just Hotline Miami's call, I guess. Even the game's title screen theme, Horse Steppin', is a tame, almost dreamy composition with distorted notes and droning vocals. The The thick reverb makes the track sound like it's being recorded someplace cavernous, like a church, as if the listener is traveling to somewhere beyond their own world, like they're departing to Hotline Miami's twisted and psychotic universe. Unlike many other tracks on the list, neither Jacket nor Biker is involved. It's just the main menu. It's the game speaking directly to the player, giving them one final warning to turn back before entering Jacket's own personal hell. But then there's Deep Cover, the theme before each mission where Jacket is still at his home. The normalcy dissipates and the protagonist is hurled back into his psychopathic killing spree. Deep Cover is a sonically taxing track. Beneath muddled beats and a blaring siren of a hook, the player must prepare for the bloodbath they will be initiating. It's suffocating, looming, and cacophonous, filled to the brim with warped melodies and key rhythms that never sound fully on tempo. It's capped off with these garbled but crooning vocal bites, and when listened to in its entirety, there's an inescapable feeling that something isn't quite right. The protagonist is once again being pulled into the fray, and Deep Cover is Jacket standing on the precipice, steadily being pushed closer and closer to the edge until there's nothing left to do but jump. Jacket's Nightmares have probably one of the most disturbing tracks on the docket, Coconut's Silver Lights. It starts with these low groaning notes before blaring out with these sour, raspy sirens and smearing the noise with droning distant vocals. It's the sounds of an instrumental torture chamber, a cry for help, the same sense of desperation that Jacket is wrapped in throughout these sequences. The animal-headed characters that Jacket interacts with are already unsettling to look at, and the dim atmospheric lighting makes the scenes even creepier. But Silver Lights is just the cherry on top. The track growls with a disgusting timbre, feeling completely unclean. Sure, you want to pay attention to the story at hand and what each creature is saying, but once you start listening to the music in these scenes, it's hard to ignore it. Silver Lights tells a story and paints a picture, like any fantastic musical composition should do in a game, especially one with such disturbed characters powering its narrative. And that's what really makes Hotline Miami's soundtrack so fascinating. These danceable beats and hooky electronics manage to transcend the stereotypical style, resulting in something panicked and unhinged. It's a soundtrack that so often sounds like it's seconds away from shattering to pieces. Like Jacket's fragile headspace, the music of Hotline Miami uses the aesthetic of violence to walk tenuously across a mental tightrope. 1 second you're grooving along to captivating electronic beats and pulses. The next you're catching your breath with clean, shimmering notes, only to be dragged back into a haunting chasm of droning noise and suffocating vocals. When it all comes together, Hotline Miami is a story about a man who, at his own fault or another's, is coming apart at the seams. And the game's soundtrack does so much to make Jacket's journey into something hypnotic, visceral, and impossible to escape. I could go on and on about every single track in Hotline Miami's listing, the nimble panic of Release, the gritty funk of It's Safe Now, the cold serenity of Electric Dreams, but this scratched record has pretty much been set straight. Whether the stage is just kicking off or you're stepping across corpses to get to your escape ride, Hotline Miami's soundtrack never skips a beat in making the player feel the burn of its sick and twisted world.